We are the Astrology Star Sisters, and we're talking about the new moon forecast for the Virgo eclipse 2025. Welcome, Simon. It's so good to have you back on my show. How are you doing?
Thank you. It's good to be back, Liz.
Awesome.
Doing pretty decent. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. So, Madam Simon is an archetypal astrologer, tarot reader, and visionary artist. Her website is iconalchemy.com. I'm Elizabeth Liz Muschett, and I'm an astrologer, author, intuitive, and tarot reader, and my website is alightpath.com. So, the Virgo eclipse is a new moon, and instead of manifesting so much, I chose and talked to Simon about this, and we chose the word honoring. So, normally at the balsamic moon and the new moon, I write down what I wish to release. Be very careful and eclipses of doing that because they don't exactly go how we plan them. So it's just like keep it really simple. And then, at the sliver of the new moon, then I, put my intentions out there. But I'm going to let Simon share what she does on the eclipse.
So, eclipses are cosmic wild cards. Okay. Um, uh, while it is certainly possible to do manifesting or magical work, ritual work during an eclipse, it has a tendency to go sideways. Even if it ends up, doing something close to what you originally wanted, it can take a roundabout way to get there, or it can do it with unforeseen consequences. Okay. And so, therefore, um, my focus during eclipses is um, is more on aligning myself with the energies of the signs involved. I recognize that an eclipse is acting a bit like a big reset button in that area of life. Okay. Um, and so then one of the best things that we can do during an eclipse, especially an eclipse in Virgo, is cleaning magic, cleaning, tidying, getting rid of things we don't need. Um, also, ritual bathing during an eclipse, I think, is a very good thing to do. Where you kind of put into the water, as you're sitting in the water, to put into it what you want to release. Um, and water is said to carry memory. Okay, and is has associations with emotion. And so our feelings about whatever it is that we're watching kind of shift under the eclipse, right? whatever area of life we're expecting to, like, we're going to do some resetting, we're going to do some big changes here, even if we don't know what they are, right? But to kind of like release our feelings about that into the water and let that carry away anything that we don't need, especially for this eclipse, which is at the South Node. Um, and South Node can, you know, show where we are, where we've gotten kind of a little too comfortable in some areas, um, and and where we may need to clear some space. So.
Well, thank you for all that. That's really a good idea. I like the bath part, so I'm going to try that this time. Awesome. So we're going to, the new moon is at 29 degrees Virgo in 5 minutes. This is the second new moon in a row, but this one's, just for a moment going to be here, and then we're moving on to the next moon phase. It occurs at 12:54 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time and 3:54 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on September 21st. So we're going to take a look first at the aspects that the moon is making. The moon is conjunct Mercury and the Sun, sextile to Juno, trine Uranus and Pluto, square Hygeia, and opposite Saturn and Neptune. So, what would you like to tell us about that, Simon?
So first things first, this eclipse is at 29 degrees of Virgo. And so that is big ending energy, big wrapping up, okay? Especially since it's opposing Saturn. And Saturn has gone back into Pisces, which is the last sign of the zodiac, eldest sign, okay, to wrap up whatever unfinished business we have in Pisces. From actually the past like a year and a half, 2 years or so. And Saturn's going to be in Pisces for the next few months. Okay. So that big ending or big wrapping up energy is an interesting kind of paradoxical feeling for a new moon, because new moons typically are about beginning a cycle, right? And yet, what this reminds me of is something that I sometimes have told my tarot clients in particular. You can't start the new business until you finish the old business. Okay. This is just like, we're at a meeting and we're like, oh, we got to we want to do this brand new thing. But wait, there's something that needs to be wrapped up, completed, cleared out, gotten off the table before we can proceed. Okay. So I think that's like one of the biggest themes for this new moon. Okay. And the eclipse that accompanies it. So this new moon and eclipse are also trine Uranus and Pluto. That's a cross sign trine. Okay. So it's by degree rather than by sign. So it is not in the same element, but it is close enough for that we should be paying attention to it, especially since the sun's going to go into Libra the very next day and will really make that trine a grand air trine. And Mercury, who is, the psychopomp, the messenger of the gods, has already gone ahead to make that trine. So we do have a grand air trine in effect. Okay. And so that definitely can have our minds feeling a little intense, maybe even a little overloaded, because when Uranus is in the mix, of course, that kind of, it can make things move a little faster. Can also bring us kind of ideas and insights that come out of the blue. Like, where the heck was that from? Why am I thinking that? Okay. And Pluto very much relates to, among other things, kind of, the depths of the subconscious, things that are under the surface, mysteries, secrets. Okay. And I find this very interesting because, we've got that Mercury that governs our thought and communication, who also rules Virgo, where the eclipse is occurring. In that trine with Pluto, Mercury is separating from the trine, but basically for the past few days, Mercury has been in aspect, in trine with that Pluto, and so has been encouraging us to think more deeply about things, and to be persistent in trying to uncover the truth. Okay. And so we may continue to see revelations, particularly on the world stage, about things that maybe folks have tried to keep secret, or things that that have been going on in the background but are now bubbling up to the surface. So again, things that we did not expect on a personal level were like, oh, wait a minute, why is this the first I'm hearing of this? And yet it's actually been going on under the surface on the world or national levels. Okay. That's also the case with cultural stuff in the United States, I think some people have been getting an education, a very sudden education within the past week about various internet subcultures they were not aware of before that are now shaping national events. Okay. So, looking back again at that opposition that I mentioned with Saturn, Neptune is also right there. Even though Saturn and Neptune no longer share the same sign, they are still less than 2 degrees apart, it looks like. And so, actually, no, a little over 2 degrees apart. So, that being the case, they are still considered conjunct. They are still sort of sharing some of their vibe, their energy with each other, and trying, maybe jockeying for position a little bit. Okay. And so again, that goes with this ongoing theme that we've had ever since these two got real close to each other in the spring. Okay, and over the summer in particular, when they got to just within 14 minutes of each other, right? And it is, of course, again, giving us some foreshadowing of their conjunction at the 0 point of Aries in February of 2026, right? So they're still continuing this ongoing relationship leading up to that big event. But they are no longer sharing the same sign. And so that kind of changes the tension between them. When two outer planets or two social planets in particular, or in this case, an outer and a social together, when they're so close to each other in the sky, there can be kind of this sort of tussle, in terms of who is dominant, right? Now, Saturn is the classical last planet of among the planets, the end of the solar system, okay? Because he's the last planet we can consistently see with the naked eye, okay? And then when we discovered the outers, of course, that really changed our perception of, wait, it's not over yet. There's more, okay? And so with these outer planets, these transcendental planets, they tend to work with the other planets in a very different way than, let's say, when you've got, Mars and Venus working together, which is also going on here, but we'll get to that. An outer planet tends to transform whatever it touches from the ground up. It is this kind of slow, seismic change, okay, rumbling beneath the surface of things, but it can have profound effects, okay. And when we're looking at Neptune right there with Saturn, even though they're in two very different signs, there is this kind of, Neptune is in Aries, which is youngest sign and about newness, but it's retrograde, so it's reconsidering the newness, okay? But it is very much oriented toward, what new vision are we bringing to the table on a grand scale, on a, all of humanity, all of the world, all living things scale, okay? And that new vision, then, part of what Neptune does is it can fog things up, and it tends to dissolve things. It dissolves structure. Meanwhile, Saturn is like, I want structure, I want rules, I want all things to remain the same. Saturn is big on the status quo. Okay. Which is why Saturn is in kind of uncomfortable territory when in Aries. Okay. But in Pisces, now it's reviewing our old status quo feelings, our our ability to have compassion for others, our spiritual leanings, okay, and can be concerned with matters of, again, it's Pisces, so it's the end of the zodiac. So again, it's that kind of concern with maturity. It's actually the big area where Saturn and Pisces work well together, is because they are both concerned with maturity. Okay. And in this case, Saturn is reviewing and potentially revising, what is our spiritual outlook and our emotional outlook. Okay. And when Saturn was in Pisces during the past couple of years, Saturn was very much helping a lot of us to level up when it came to our emotional maturity, and also for those of us with spiritual practices, to actually help us, like, okay, now it's time to really get serious about your practice. Okay, to get serious about belief. Remember that Pisces classically is ruled by Jupiter, and Jupiter governs faith and religion. Okay. What are your beliefs? What are your ideals? And are you going to take them seriously? How are you going to allow them to structure your life? Okay. And where do they interfere with what is structured or practical in your life? Okay. So that is what is opposing this eclipse. Okay. And so, this eclipse being, it's now separated, the sun and the moon have separated from the south node, but they are still in the vicinity of that south node. They are still sharing the same sign, still co-present with the south node. And Saturn is now co-present with the north node, which is conjoined by the centaur Nessus. And Nessus has a reputation for being abusive and even violent. Okay. And so, Saturn now reapplying to Nessus and the North Node. He's not going to actually reach them, but he's still moving closer to them, is reminding us that we as a species have a lot of development left to do when it comes to addressing violence and abuse within our societies. Okay. And within our, within our close circles as well. Okay. Note that North Node and Nessus are trine Jupiter. We'll get to that later as well. Anyway, so the moon is, having this conversation with Saturn and Neptune. Anytime planets are opposite each other, they have heightened awareness of each other. Oppositions are of the nature of Saturn, so they're not like, it's not like they're moving toward each other, right? They are kind of in this position where they're stopped and looking at each other. Okay. And they can't really make forward progress until they get a good look at the issues they're each raising. Okay. Juno is at the point of Thales to this opposition. Okay. And so is Pluto. Okay. And so, Pluto can show us the kind of hidden power structures and power dynamics that are at work, particularly on a societal level. Okay. And then at the same time, Pluto is really very interested in showing us what is overripe. Okay. What needs to be thrown into the compost heap and right quick. Okay. But of course, those who have power tend to be reluctant to relinquish it. Okay. Those who have profited by the status quo are like, oh, no, we're going to double down and try to, hold on tight. Okay. And so there we see the kind of power struggles, and the intensity and the complexity that Pluto also shows us. And so Pluto here is reminding us that that emotional maturity that Saturn is inviting the moon and the sun to consider, while the sun is like, in this eclipsed state, our consciousness is not really online. Okay. And we're more operating on an unconscious level because of that moon. Okay. So there's a lot of like big underworld energy going on with this. Okay. And Juno there, who is at the other point of Thales to this opposition, is reminding us, she's been on this journey through Scorpio, considering how do we really feel about the institutions and the relationships and the commitments in our lives. You know, and what's been lurking under the surface of those things, what power dynamics are at work there, what deep feelings do we have that we may not have previously acknowledged. Okay. And anything in Scorpio, when it makes up its mind to actually speak on something, is going to say what it feels in no uncertain terms. Okay. Scorpio can be very silent for a while, as it's sussing out the situation. But when the time comes to speak up, it's got that scorpionic sting to it, right? So, that can show us where there's some tension in our relationships, some tension in the social order and the social fabric, and really intense and deep feelings underneath the surface of things, that we need to pay attention to and process in order to then be able to do anything about those dynamics. Okay. We can't heal the relationships. We can't rebuild the institutions, or, we shouldn't wipe them off the map entirely unless we've actually looked at what's going on under the surface of stuff. So that's what Juno's there to remind us of during this. This eclipse is square Hygeia, and she has moved into Cancer, which is ruled by the moon. She's answering to that moon. But she's, and she's now separating from the square. It's not quite as intense as it was in the days leading up to the eclipse, but there is still that tension there. We may find that our attention is being drawn to areas in our emotional life and in our family life that it could use some adjustment, that are not entirely copacetic. Okay. And so that is what that square then is there to try to stimulate. And of course, the eclipse trine Uranus brings lots of uncertainty, big change, disruption, can bring some great insights. Okay. I mean, Uranus is really, really good for stimulating our genius. Okay. But in combination with an eclipse makes it all the more likely that things may go haywire. So, the real key, I think, to navigating this stuff is to do our best to be flexible, right? If there's sudden changes that we weren't expecting, or, crazy little surprises. And at the same time, be willing to look under the surface of things in order to understand those changes. They may not be what they appear at first glance.
Thank you. That's wonderful. And I like how you said about finishing up old business before you begin new, because Saturn has recently re-entered Pisces. So to me, I think of that as finishing up some business of when Saturn was in Pisces originally and
Mhm.
then ingressed into Aries, but then had to go back. And Neptune will retrograde back into Pisces, and Uranus will retrograde back into Taurus. So that theme could
Mhm.
continue for some time to come, I would say.
Yeah,
But I
definitely.
wanted to add that. Thank you. Okay, so we have some aspect patterns to start with. We have an air earth grand trine kite with a second minor grand trine. And Simon was talking about the grand trine already previously. So we have the sun, moon,
Mhm.
and Mercury, trine Pluto, and trine Uranus. And then to form the kite, we have the sextiles from Saturn and Neptune to Uranus and Pluto. And then we have another little minor grand trine there with Vesta, trine Saturn, and their sextile to Pluto. So I'll turn it over to you now.
Yeah, Vesta is more, yeah, is actually more closely trying to Neptune. Um, you know, uh, Neptune still being in Aries, so that's a nice fire trine. That's very active and spirited. Okay, um, and can help perhaps bolster some of our ideals, especially when it comes to our courage, our willingness to face things that might otherwise seem scary. Um, so that minor trine with Pluto, I think is very helpful for getting us to pay attention to the big forces in our lives. And Vesta very much relates to our focus. Okay. Um, and she is, of course, she also relates to that sacred flame within us, what we hold sacred enough to then motivate ourselves in a particular direction. Okay. She is the goddess of the hearth, but of course, she's named for the Roman version, and so there are overtones of empire there, of what is the hearth of the empire, what is the hearth of the nation, what keeps the nation alive. Okay, so in this context with Neptune and with Pluto, then Neptune very much does relate to what are our ideals, what is our grand vision, what is it, what are our dreams, and sometimes our illusions and delusions. um, and so there is that focus there. I do find it interesting, Neptune also has a relationship with celebrities, with movie stars, with entertainers. Um, and so, Vesta in that trine with Neptune may increase our attention on certain entertainers, as has been the case in the United States in recent days. And in connection with Pluto, then may also, kind of put some attention on how is the government interacting with people when it comes to their ways of entertaining us or not. Um, so that one I think is an interesting little configuration in light of recent events. Yeah, so we should also note that the grand trine and kite, they involve Uranus and Sedna. Sedna is one of the trans-Neptunian objects who moves incredibly, incredibly slowly. She has, I believe, an 11,000 year orbit of the sun, very elliptical orbit. Um, and of course, right now she's so close to Uranus. They got real close to conjunct, not quite, just like the Saturn Neptune thing. And then they did the retrograde dance and are, heading back toward Taurus. I don't think Sedna is going to re-enter Taurus. I think she'll still stay in Gemini, but Uranus is going to retrograde back to Taurus. So I do find that interesting, where we've got this eclipse, okay, that is at the tail end of Virgo, an earth sign, but also with Mercury in the ruler of Virgo in an air sign, in Libra. Mercury is the one truly forming the grand air trine with Pluto and with Uranus, right? And Mercury rules Gemini, where Uranus and Sedna are, okay? And so there's this kind of wobble back and forth between the earth and the air, between the practical and physical, and our thoughts and communication. And I really feel like that's foreshadowing this shift, as Uranus is going to go back into an earth sign. Neptune is soon going to go back into Pisces. And there's going to be that kind of wrapping up, even while Pluto still stays in an air sign, right? And so we're kind of doing this like waffling back and forth between yin and yang energies, okay? And I feel like that's a big part of our wrapping up energy, is this back and forth between what are our minds doing versus what we're doing with our bodies and on this kind of practical physical level. Okay. The narrative that we tell ourselves has a profound ability to shape our practical actions. Our physicality, our health gets shaped by this. Okay. You know, if we're ruminating too much, if we're going in a depressive spiral, or, you know, up into an anxiety little whirlwind, you know, that is going to have an impact on our bodies. And it's going to have an impact on what can we get done that is actually practical. Okay. So yeah, I feel like this is part of that larger pattern. And also, this is a reminder that because both earth and air are involved in this configuration and coloring this eclipse, that we need to try to be mindful of the effects of our thinking on whatever it is that we are doing. Virgo is very concerned with habits, with health, with learning, with growth. Okay. And so I feel like, you know, one of the things about the eclipse is that the whatever's being eclipsed, it is not operating in its normal function. Okay. And the sun represents the light of consciousness. So our conscious awareness under the eclipse is not operating the way it normally does, right? So yeah, being mindful may be a kind of a tall order, okay, under such circumstances. So it's more a matter of I'm suggesting that we just kind of want to let ourselves be calmly aware. And if we start having thoughts that may have a detrimental effect, okay, or that are part of a toxic pattern, that this may be a time when we can very gently catch ourselves and, you know, kind of, okay, it's time to take a step back from those habitual thought patterns or those narratives that we've been telling ourselves that are not actually helping. And we may need to, you know, do some things with regard to our routines or our habits at this time that help back that up, that say, you know what, it's time to stop doing things in the same old way, and, you know, get some help there from that Uranus trine, okay, and consider new possibilities. We may not want to make any big shifts right now, right under the light of the eclipse, because of that wild card energy. But this is a time for us to be able to consider those things, to get some new ideas as a result of that we can kind of meditate on.
Wonderful. So now we'll go into an aspect pattern of Yods. It's two inconjuncts, which are 150 degrees apart, and then they're connected by 2 points or planets with a sextile. And we have three in this new moon chart. Venus being one of the aspect points or the focal point, with quincunx to Pluto and Saturn and Neptune. Mars is another focal point with a quincunx to Uranus and Sedna, and also Saturn and Neptune, because they're all connecting with each other. And then the other focal point is Saturn and Neptune quincunx to Venus and Mars. So a lot of Yod energy. Go ahead.
Right. So 3 overlapping Yods. I find that a little bit interesting in terms of what on earth we're supposed to do with it. Because um, Yods, effectively what's going on is that the quincunxes are an aspect formed by degree, but not sharing an element or modality. And so the planets in question, it's like they're aware of each other, but they do not know how to get each of their needs met simultaneously. And so there can be kind of a teeter-totter, back and forth energy that goes on as we try to make sense of these two very different sets of energies. Okay. So when you have a yod, you've got two of those teeter-tottering kind of sets of energies, that are united by the sextile at one end, and then the planet that is at the apex of the yod is getting all the pressure from both of those quincunxes. And so the yod, which is sometimes called the finger of God, has to do with this like intense set of feeling of pressure at the apex planet. But here, where we've got multiple apex planets, it's like, oh my goodness, like, how do I deal with like multiple pressure points being triggered? Okay. Um, Now I think it is helpful that two of the Yods point to Mars and Venus, since Mars and Venus are in cahoots. They're both, sextile each other, supportive of each other. They're like, oh man, we're both feeling the pressure, Here, you want to commiserate, right? Um, so in that sense, I think that can be helpful for us to be able to integrate these challenging energies. The other two yod bases are part of that minor grand trine between the outers that's been going on for a while and will continue on through 2027. Okay. Um, and in this case, it really is. It's, all three of these outer planets that have been operating together for a while, plus the social planet of Saturn. Okay. They've all been doing their thing together for a while and will for a while to come. Okay. These big, big forces in our lives that are beyond our immediate control, that relate to societal, generational, um, sort of shifts in how humanity is operating. Okay. Um, and then we've got these two personal planets with these big forces arrayed, like they're like, whoa, whoa, hey, wait a minute. What do you want with little old me? And I think for a lot of people right now, that is an ongoing thing that I'm seeing in the zeitgeist, that I'm seeing among my clients. Okay. Like, holy moly, I just wanted to live my life in peace and do my thing. Why is all there this big stuff suddenly going on that's constantly demanding my attention that I don't know what to do about? Okay. So I think that the sextile between Venus and Mars is the key to being able to work with all of these energies. Okay. That that sextile says, you know, be kind to each other, connect or reconnect with people around you, find ways then to have your social instincts, your relationship instincts align with your actions, with your personal will. Note that Mars here is on the verge of heading into his home sign of Scorpio. He is currently in a Venus ruled sign. And so he is considered to be in detriment here. He's in the sign opposite his other home sign of Aries. And Venus is in her fall. She is in Virgo opposite Pisces, which is the sign of her exaltation. So neither Venus nor Mars are comfortable, right? They don't have the resources that they're used to. They have to get creative about doing the things that they're going to do. Venus in Virgo is at her best when she is paying attention to, what are the needs of others that I care about? How can I perhaps be of service to others? Where can I do things that will be helpful to the people I wish to connect with, or who I'm already connected with? So when I come visit my friend Liz, when I come hang out with you and you offer me a cup of tea, that is a Virgo. That is a classic Venus and Virgo thing, because I like the tea. That's going to make me happy, right? And so Venus in Virgo, I that example is like the best, the easiest one I can come up with. But there's all sorts of ways for us to be mindful. Remember that Virgo is ruled by Mercury. To be mindful of what makes other people around us feel safe, secure, happy, and loved. What is a practical love language that we can speak? Okay. And then Mars in that Venus ruled Libra. Mars isn't terribly comfortable trying to be peacemaker or do the nicey nice stuff. But one thing Mars is very good at in Libra is fighting for justice. Okay. And paying attention to, okay, I'm not normally, as Mars is like not normally concerned with what is fair, but here Mars is being asked to pay attention to what is fair. That if you're going to take action, it needs to be equitable. It needs to not screw over other people. And Mars can very much relate to our willpower. And when we're up against massive societal generational forces, our willpower is most certainly going to be tested. Okay. But finding ways to stay balanced in how we are exerting our energy and how we are fighting the good fight. That is what is key when we're working with Mars in the context of these configurations. Okay. And so, Mars is getting the pressure from the Saturn Neptune conjunction and from the Uranus Sedna conjunction. So Mars is being pressured by big forces of change, but also what are we still maintaining? Because Saturn is about status quo. And, so what do we keep? What do we get rid of? And what is the vision for both of those things. And so Mars is under pressure to act in accordance with all of that. Okay. Venus is under pressure, not only from, our sense of responsibility, our, uh, and our vision for the future, like I said, but also, it's real easy to get caught up in, both dreams and illusions and fantasies, but also our fears with that Saturn Neptune combination. Okay. And so it's really important for us to remember to connect with others in order to mitigate fear. Okay. And also not, um, not descend into avoidance through pleasure seeking. Venus just wants to have fun. Okay. And she could very much be like, la, 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 I'm not paying attention to this stuff, right? Except at the apex of that yod, it's very hard for her to completely ignore what's going on, right? There's lots of pressure there. And Pluto, of course, just makes whatever he touches more intense. So I really feel like Venus and Mars need to really lean into that sextile. They are both debilitated. They're both having a hard time. And, for all of us, there are lots of areas in life right now where we're having hard times. So much hard times going around for lots of people. And so the reminder is, put out your hand. Find somebody to hold hands with through the dark, scary places. Okay. And then that may require some courage, which Mars is good at. Okay. But yeah, connecting with others is the best way to navigate all this stuff.
Well, that's great advice. I like that. So then we have a mystic rectangle, which is made up of 2 sextiles, 2 trines, and 2 oppositions that all connect with each other. So we have the Saturn Neptune is sextile to Uranus and Sedna, and they are trine to that sun and moon. And then the sun and moon are sextile to Juno, and then Juno is trine to Saturn and Neptune. So you can go ahead.
Well, so we've talked a whole lot about all these various things. I've talked about the opposition from the eclipse to Saturn and Neptune. Have talked a little bit about, about the trine from the eclipse, and Mercury to that Uranus and Sedna combination. A little reminder with regard to Sedna. Sedna, like Pluto, does bring some underworld overtones to all of this, but she's oceanic, and she's very much about transforming victimization into power. Okay. And when you see her with Uranus opposite Juno, then there can be, again, there's like shakeups with regard to what are our relationships, what are our institutions, what is the societal fabric. And I think, particularly with regard to the big focus that has been on the Epstein files in the United States, in particular, a huge part of that is as a result of that applying opposition and that sense of like, hey, we need to change how people who have been victimized are being treated. We need to do things to prevent that kind of victimization. Okay. And more people, in order to address their own feelings of victimization, are then, of course, linking and joining hands with other people who have been victimized in order to advocate for justice. Juno trine Saturn in particular, like she's loosely trine to Neptune, but she's much more tightly trine to Saturn right now. That can help us to to reinforce some relationships, those that are meant to last, those that are worth keeping alive. But remember that Saturn is in retrograde right now. And so Saturn's reconsidering what deserves to stick around and what shouldn't. Okay. And again, Juno is going to be concerned with what are the power dynamics underneath all of that. And what are we willing to do in order to keep those our commitments, in order to keep our relationships alive, in order to keep our institutions alive. Remember that Scorpio, being classically ruled by Mars, and the transcendental rulership is Pluto, there is extremely powerful will at work anytime we're dealing with Scorpio. But there is also this intensity and the willingness to be kind of ruthless. Okay. And so, one of the important things for us to remember with regard to any of these kinds of transits is that, well, yes, there's ways that we can lean into those energies and make use of them. So can people who we don't necessarily get along with. Okay. So can people whose motivations we may not like. Okay. And so it's important then to pay attention to, hey, this stuff is going on that bigger level. Anytime we've got the societal planets, the social planets of Saturn or Jupiter involved, anytime we've got the outer planets involved, it's going on a much bigger level than us individually. And so we can look at, how do I tap into this? How do I work with this? But also, how do I protect myself from anyone who might be using it in an untoward fashion? Okay. Scorpio can bring out our more suspicious side. And I think that, Juno in Scorpio has been raising that for some relationships, but in particular for institutions. Okay. And that people have been less willing to trust. Okay. Where they previously, were like, oh no, Juno, when she went through Libra, was certainly going to be more more trusting of relationships as a whole, more like willing to, yeah, I want to uphold these. Yeah, it is good for us to, have things be nice and harmonious and socially balanced and all of that. But in Scorpio, she's a lot more brooding, a lot less willing to get along, to go along to get along. Okay. She is more willing to rock the boat. And at the same time, if there's something that she is really dedicated to, that she's absolutely committed to making this happen, she may do some ruthless things. Okay. That part of our psyche is more inclined to be ruthless right now. So that's just something we need to be aware of here. Especially since she's in that trine with Saturn, and Saturn can dredge up our fears, right? And our insecurities. And so it's important for us to not go off half-cocked because we're feeling insecure and decide to do something super ruthless that we might regret later.
Absolutely. Well, and the mystic rectangle is also made up of 2 points of Thales, and the mystic rectangle, it's like a beautiful aspect, but it does require that the effort and work is put in to have that reward or that gift from the efforts put into whatever we need to work on.
Yeah, remember that since it's got two oppositions operating in it, both of those are places to be aware, right? But they're also places where we might have to stop before we can make progress.
Absolutely. Thank you. And we have a T-square with Venus square Uranus, Sedna, and Vesta. A couple of squares, Mars square Pluto and Neptune square Hygeia. And an opposition with Mercury opposite Ceres. So go ahead.
Okay. So Venus squaring off against this Uranus Sedna opposition to Vesta. I said before that, Vesta relates to our focus. Okay. And Vesta in opposition to Uranus and Sedna then is going to have this heightened awareness of the changes going on around us. But because Sedna's involved, can also have heightened awareness of where we think that things are unfair, where we feel victimized. And yet, if we're paying attention, we can also then find where do we come into our power as a result of the challenges that we are facing, particularly when it comes to the kind of changes that can blindside us. How resilient are we being? Remember that Vesta is her temple was the site of the eternal flame. And so, how do we tend and renew that spark of vitality within us when we are faced with stuff kind of, buffeting us about? Uranus and Gemini can be a bit of a whirlwind, right? And in particular, can bombard us with information. Okay. Also with technological changes, some of which are really challenging. And because Uranus is there with Sedna, some of those technological changes can have us feeling really victimized. AI. Excuse me. Depending upon who is in power, who's in control of a situation, right? And so then Venus squaring that, Venus in Virgo wants to be in service, wants to help us grow through our relationships, wants to help us learn. Okay. And here she is kind of, coming into say, hey, you two, you've been staring each other down, or you three, I should say, you've been staring each other down. But there are social concerns. There are real people's needs that need to be addressed. Okay. I do feel like anytime we've got a hard aspect with Uranus and a personal planet, it can feel jarring. There can be sudden shakeups, breakups, okay, divorces, that kind of thing. We can also see, some kind of reordering of our friendships, our social circles, also reordering of our finances. There can be unpleasant surprises with our finances when we're looking at this combination. And again, because Vesta is involved, I think that it's very much tying the personal to the societal. Okay. So more of the same, just in a different kind of different tone, different, some different ways of these themes manifesting. But overall, we're living through these times when big changes are at work around the planet in multiple societies. We've seen lots of protests. We've seen revolts. We've seen authoritarian crackdowns. We've seen all of that going on around the world right now. And, that relates to all of those outer planets being in cahoots. But now here we've got Venus being like, hey, there are little ordinary people who are getting caught up in your whirlwind. Maybe you should pay attention to them, what they need. Okay. So then we've also got Mercury opposite Ceres. I find that one particularly interesting. Mercury is applying to this opposition with Ceres. Ceres is retrograde. Ceres relates to how we nourish and nurture ourselves and others. She can also show us where we have grief that needs to be addressed. And typically when we are working with Ceres, we want to look to her polarity point. We want to look to whatever is opposite her in order to find solutions to the concerns that she raises. And here we have Mercury at that in that opposition, saying that we need to be thinking, but Mercury is in Venus's home sign of Libra. Note that Mercury is in mutual reception with Venus. Okay. So they are supportive of each other being in the other planet's home. Okay. They're like, oh, you're my honored guest. Oh, you're my honored guest. Okay. We're doing a home swap right now. Okay. And so that gives them a little bit more support, which is good for Venus, since she's in her fall right now. Okay. So again, that Mercury relates to our thoughts and communication. Okay. In Libra, this is thought and communication that are socially oriented, relationship oriented, but also oriented toward fairness, toward justice. And how do we achieve peace? How do we make things more harmonious? Okay. Ceres retrograde in Aries can feel like our sense of individuality, our identities are being perhaps reconsidered, challenged a bit. And so this is one of those big push-pull kind of things that we see in astrology, this particular polarity of the needs of the individual versus the needs of the group, the needs of society, or the needs of a couple, or the needs of relationship. Okay. And so right now, because they're in opposition, this is that need to stop and get clear, to be aware of the needs of both sides of the polarity, to recognize that humans are social creatures, and at the same time, we can't expect everybody to just like smooth over everything without actually getting their individual needs met. Okay. Uniformity is not actually going to help us on a massive societal scale, or even on an individual relationship scale. Okay. When we have friendships or romantic relationships with somebody else, if one side is always giving in to the other and always saying, yes, dear, whatever you want, that's not actually going to be a healthy relationship. And so there is a need to pay attention to what are the areas of grief or pain of the people who we are choosing to relate to. Okay. What are the areas where they could use some nurturing, some nourishment? Heck, what do they like to eat? Remember, Ceres relates to food. Okay. So I think a great thing to do with this, this opposition as it's applying, both, during the eclipse, but also in the days immediately following the eclipse, take some time to eat together. Take some time to sit down and break bread together and talk over a meal. I think that could be incredibly helpful for being able to clearly see each other and honor our individuality, even as we are trying to stay connected. Finally, we got 2 additional squares. We've got Mars square Pluto. Mars is applying to the square with Pluto. The day after the eclipse, Mars is going to go into Scorpio. And then it's going to be more, much more tightly square Pluto. And we've also got Neptune square Hygeia. So, and that Neptune is answering to that Mars, because that Neptune is in Mars's home sign of Aries. So Mars, when Mars gets into Scorpio, it's going to be in his nighttime realm. His daytime realm is Aries. Okay. And so that's going to be an empowered Mars. Right now, for the eclipse, Mars is still in detriment. Okay. And so it's like this weak Mars that is facing off against those big societal forces, against potentially uneven power dynamics, against corruption, against big institutional power, big financial power. Pluto is definitely the planet of oligarchs. Okay. And so, Mars here at this 29th degree of Libra, Mars through Libra has been learning about, okay, how do I act in a way that upholds fairness? How do I act in ways that, are kind? How do I assert my will kindly? How do I make effort to achieve peace and harmony? But also, being Mars isn't very peaceful. So how do I fight the good fight? How do I achieve justice? Okay. When Mars heads into his home sign of Scorpio, now we got a ruthless Mars. Now this is Mars with the gloves off. Okay. This is a Mars who is not wanting to play nice. This is Mars who's been like, okay, I tried it the nice way. Now I'm going to do it my way. The problem is, of course, Pluto being a transcendental planet, an outer planet, Pluto has the last say. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't stand up and fight for what we believe to be right. That doesn't mean that we can't assert our will. But under this particular square, we may find tempers flaring. There is a greater potential for frustration, for impatience, and for situations where individuals are up against institutional forces. Having this square going on during the eclipse and the subsequent Libra ingress, makes for interesting times. But point being, it can make there be this kind of a lot of underlying tension. And so it's important to be aware of that. We may want to do things that are maybe some physical activities to kind of get out our aggressions in a safe manner. Also being aware that anytime we've got Mars in a hard aspect to something, there's a greater potential for accidents, a greater potential for injuries. Okay. So that can really add to the stresses of this particular eclipse. And if we, endeavor to be mindful about that, if we lean into the Mars-Venus sextile, then we can potentially find ways to diffuse some of that. But we want to be aware that that is part of the landscape right now. Okay. And just because we're making efforts to diffuse it doesn't mean that somebody else near us is also going to make those efforts. So, pays to stay awake and aware. The square from Neptune to Hygeia, because Neptune is in Mars's daytime realm, Neptune is going to be feeling that tension between Mars and Pluto. Neptune, among other things, relates to our imaginations. And when our imaginations are in a sign that is already known for being impulsive, it is very easy to let our imaginations run away with us. Okay. Um, and because Saturn is so close by, that can like pull a lot of our fears into the mix. Okay. Or depression can also be a big factor when we've got Saturn so close by. And so, if we're prone to these things, it's important for us to be aware of that right now, because Neptune in Aries, being in this impulsive Mars ruled sign while Mars is going through this hard aspect with Pluto, can we can see situations where we've got a contest of wills at work, that Mars Pluto square, and it in turn fuels our imaginations running away with us in, going all over the place and not actually doing anything very helpful. Okay. And because Neptune is square Hygeia, that in turn can negatively impact our emotional health and in particular our family life, because Hygeia is currently in the sign of Cancer, ruled by the moon that is part of that eclipse. Okay. So both Neptune and Hygeia are really being heavily influenced by two other very challenging transits. Okay. Um, and so it's really important for us to pay attention and not come out swinging for a fight with those closest to us just because we're feeling moody and scared and and letting our imaginations run wild. Okay. Um, this is a time when it can be helpful for us to try to tend to some things around home, um, to be kind to ourselves, to take time for self-care. um, Aia being in Cancer, that's a water sign ruled by the moon. Again, I recommend things like baths. Baths are nice, or a shower or whatever like feels comfortable like that. But doing things to care for the body in particular, um, but specifically caring for the body in ways that also help us tend to our emotions. Okay, so that we can process emotions in a way that is not going to result in like some massive kind of confusing spat. Which is a very strong likelihood if we're not paying attention and doing that self-care, and and also supporting and being supported by the others around us via that Venus Mars sextile.
A lot going on, and I like that you earlier said about, holding hands with somebody and doing good self-care, and I would add breathe and, um, be patient with yourself and others equally.
Yeah. Yeah, patience is very important, which that Saturn opposition to the eclipse reminds us of.
Okay, so here we have, um, trines and a grand water trine. The trines are Saturn trine Juno and Neptune trine Vesta. Then we have a grand water trine with Jupiter trine the North Node, trine natural black moon Lilith, and back again. So go ahead and talk about this grand water trine, or the trines for that matter.
Yeah, so after talking about so much tense stuff going on during the eclipse, it seems like it'd be nice to talk about what's going right. um, so we've got a series of trines at work here. Saturn trine Juno. Saturn is about maintaining structures, um, being patient, persevering through difficulties, it being persistent, and having self discipline. And especially when there's so much kind of testy energy going on, having that self-discipline, that self-control to say, oh, right, I may be really ticked off at so-and-so right now, but I do value our friendship. I do value our relationship. And I'm willing to go the distance to make sure that that we can maintain this relationship. That is a very helpful iteration of that trine. Neptune, Trine, Vesta, so close. These are overlapping trines, these sets. They are technically within orb of each other. So technically, Juno is also in orb of the trine to Neptune, even though it's a cross sign trine. And the same goes for Saturn with Vesta. Okay. And so I very much feel like that reminds us to apply our imaginations in ways that uplift us, that inspire us, that keep us going when things seem dark or scary or challenging. Okay. Neptune trine Vesta can really help us with regard to our faith, with regard to our spiritual inclinations. Super, I really feel like this one is super energy for doing things like candle gazing. My inclination, of course, would be to wait until after the eclipse for that, but it does remind us to pay attention to what lights us up, and really work at maintaining that inner flame and the ideals that can feed that inner spark, that inner flame. Okay. The grand water trine, this has actually been going on since the lunar eclipse. The lunar eclipse in Pisces was part of that. It was on the North Node and Nessus. Okay. The North Node and Nessus are trine Jupiter in Cancer and trine natural black moon Lilith in Scorpio. The natural position is it's another way of calculating Lilith. And so far, it seems to be the most accurate. Lilith stuff is hard to pin down. That's kind of the nature of Lilith. Okay. But, in this grand trine with Jupiter, and with the North Node and Nessus. Nessus certainly does have, like I said, it has a reputation for violence, for abuse, but also shows us where those particular chains can be broken. For people working with multi-generational trauma in particular, Nessus can be useful for us to be able to see what are the patterns of the things that have hurt us and where can we step up and change those patterns. Where can we face our oppressors or our abusers? Okay. And bolstered by Jupiter, of course, is all about, that faith that we can do the things that we set ourselves to, that we can live up to our ideals, that that things will work out all right, despite however scary they might look. Okay. Jupiter is constantly about things can work out. You can have hope for the future. Optimism is not just like, a foolish exercise as far as Jupiter is concerned. Okay. And so Jupiter is exalted in Cancer. Now, yes, Jupiter is ruled by the moon, who is involved in that eclipse. Okay. That is coloring this a bit. But that was the case when, the lunar eclipse happened. Okay. So Jupiter does make what he touches bigger. That can make things a little intense, okay, especially when we're dealing with Lilith and Nessus, right? Lilith in particular, however, one of the things that she excels at is fighting for the underdog. Okay, she is all about standing by people who are marginalized. She would certainly stand by trans folk. She'd certainly stand by, women who have been abused or sexually taken advantage of, right? She also um, it, she favors sex workers. She favors people who are not necessarily going to be treated well by mainstream society. Okay. Um, and she is really good right now for those folks who are doing activist work to try to help people who are being abused. So I feel like this grand water trine, yes, it can bring up some intense feelings. Lilith is not, um, she's not so inclined to play nicely with anyone she views as taking advantage of her or trying to oppress her or hers in any way, right? She can be mouthy. She can be obstinate. Especially in Scorpio. Scorpio being a fixed sign, there is likely to be some stubbornness at work. And because she is the demonized feminine, okay, there are certainly people who are going to, um, if their own charts are overlapping with these placements, they may find themselves being a little unruly. Okay. And potentially being reactive. There can be some unconscious behaviors that show up here. And maybe a little antisocial in the sense of I'm not going to abide by the same rules that everybody else is telling me I should. Okay. But at the same time, her willingness to say, hey, this crap stops here. Okay. I am going to break those chains that Nessus indicates. I think that's huge. That is really useful energy for us to tap into right now if we are willing to look at the parts of ourselves that are a bit more unruly, that maybe we've been afraid to look at before, and to see our own power, and how are we using it? Okay, are we being true to ourselves? Are we being authentic? Lilith is all about what is authentic. I think that this trine can be excellent for reinforcing our own emotional integrity and the integrity of our willpower. Especially once Scorpio's ruler Mars gets into Scorpio, which is the day after the eclipse. So this eclipse season, I think, has really been about getting real with what we feel. And that's what this trine is about.
Oh, so much great information. So now we're going to move on to the lunar phase family or gestation phase. It uses the same 4 lunar phases, the new, first quarter, full, and last quarter. And each phase lasts 9 months, so it's a 3-year to complete. And it begins with a new, and we're at a new moon. Each new moon has a lunar phase family, and it's about beginnings. First quarter is about adjustments. Full phase is the realization, and third quarter is reevaluation. And we are starting the new phase September 21st at 29 degrees Virgo in 5 minutes. Then the first quarter phase will be June 21st of 2026 at 0 degrees Libra and 32 minutes. The full phase will be March 22nd of 2027 at 1 degree Libra and 35 minutes. And the third quarter phase will be December 20th of 2027 at 28 degrees Virgo and 14 minutes. So this one goes back and forth between Virgo and Libra. Then the yearly lunar phase, we are starting with this Virgo new moon, and it's the second one because we had one at 0 degrees. This one's at 29 degrees. So we had two chances or two initiating points of a new moon, and then it will share the same Virgo full moon of March 3rd of 2027 at or 2026 at 12 degrees Virgo and 54 minutes. So I find that really interesting that we had two new moons, Virgo new moons in a row, and they share the same full moon, approximately 6 months out. So well, I want to thank our audience for joining the Astrology Star Sisters today, and I want to thank Simon for joining me for the Astrology Star Sisters and talking about the Virgo eclipse. This was wonderful, and thanks to everyone that comes back and watches at a future date. And I'm going to let Simon tell you about her Patreon page.
So on Patreon, I write about the astrological transits, specifically as the fuel for my art that is based in astrology, sometimes tarot, sometimes dreams. And I do regular artistic work there, and also do custom astrological art for my patrons as part of their rewards. So if that's something of interest to you, stop on by and take a look. I also am a consulting astrologer and tarot reader, as is Liz. And so if you wish to schedule a consultation with me, please visit me at iconalchemy.com.
Thank you. And you can reach me at my email, liz@alightpath.com, for a consultation. I have a newsletter and a YouTube channel, so I always appreciate you all subscribing. There's a variety of other shows that the Astrology Star Sisters do. We have a nice archive now of shows that we've done, and we always have future shows coming up on a weekly basis. So I look forward to seeing you on my channel in the near future. I will be on Talk Cosmos on October 19th talking about the 28-degree Libra new moon. And I want to thank our sponsor, Astro Peregrine, an astrology software program for Mac and Windows. And you can find more information at astroperegrine.com. And thank you again, Simon, for joining me and our audience. And we look forward to seeing you on our next show. And we're going to say goodbye for now. Bye.